London, 1960s. The streets of the East End pulsed with danger. Smoke drifted from pubs. Whispers traveled through alleyways, and every criminal in the city knew two names that inspired equal parts fear and fascination. Ronnie and Reggie Kray. They were gangsters, celebrities, and kings of an underworld that stretched across London. Their faces appeared in newspapers. Their exploits became legends. Their crimes became the stuff of nightmares. But while the world focused on the infamous twins, another man stood quietly in the background. His name was Charlie Kray. History would remember Ronnie as a violent enforcer and Reggie as a calculating businessman. Together, they became Britain's most notorious gangsters. Yet Charlie, their older brother, remained largely forgotten. He lived his entire life in the shadow of monsters. To understand Charlie's story, we must travel back to the beginning, to the crowded streets of East London before the Krays became famous. The Kray family lived in Bethnal Green, a working-class district where poverty was common and survival often depended on toughness. The neighborhood was a place of resilience. Families squeezed into small homes. Children played among bomb-damaged buildings. Fights were settled with fists. The Krays were no exception. Their father, Charles David Kray, often struggled to provide stability. Their mother, Violet Kray, became the dominant force in the household. Fiercely protective of her sons, she instilled a powerful sense of family loyalty that would shape all three brothers for the rest of their lives. Charlie was born first. As the eldest brother, he occupied a unique position. Long before Ronnie and Reggie became household names, Charlie was simply the older sibling trying to navigate a difficult environment. Life in Bethnal Green wasn't easy. Economic hardship weighed heavily on local families. During World War II, German bombing raids devastated much of East London. Buildings collapsed. Lives were shattered. Communities learned to endure fear on a daily basis. The Kray children grew up in this atmosphere of uncertainty and toughness. For Charlie, family was everything. That loyalty would become both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. As Ronnie and Reggie matured, they developed personalities that drew attention. They were charismatic, ambitious, and intimidating. They excelled in boxing and quickly earned reputations as young men who could handle themselves in a fight. Charlie watched it happen. At first, there was little reason to suspect that the twins would one day dominate London's criminal landscape. They were simply neighborhood boys trying to make their mark. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was forming. The post-war years offered opportunities for ambitious criminals. Black markets flourished. Protection rackets expanded. Illegal gambling generated enormous profits. Ronnie and Reggie saw possibilities. Charlie saw his brothers chasing success. He could not yet know where that path would lead. Nor could he imagine that one day the names Ronnie and Reggie Kray would become synonymous with murder, violence, and organized crime. When that transformation began, Charlie would find himself caught between family loyalty and a growing realization that the people he loved were becoming some of Britain's most feared criminals. And once that journey started, there would be no turning back. The East End of London had always produced hard men. In the years following World War II, neighborhoods like Bethnal Green were rebuilding from devastation. Opportunities were scarce, and for many young men, legitimate work offered little chance of escaping poverty. The streets often rewarded those willing to take risks, bend rules, and use violence when necessary. For Ronnie and Reggie Kray, the streets became a proving ground. As teenagers, the twins built reputations as skilled amateur boxers. They possessed confidence, charisma, and an almost magnetic ability to command attention. Crowds admired them. Rivals feared them. Local criminals recognized their potential. Charlie watched from the sidelines. Being older, he often seemed less interested in the spotlight than his younger brothers. He lacked their hunger for fame and their appetite for confrontation. Yet family ties in the Kray household ran deep. No matter what path the twins chose, Charlie would remain connected to them. By the early 1950s, Ronnie and Reggie were becoming known throughout East London. Their boxing careers had introduced them to influential figures, but crime offered greater rewards. Small-time rackets, protection schemes, and illegal businesses generated money far beyond what most working-class Londoners could earn through honest labor. The twins quickly learned the value of reputation. In criminal circles, fear could be as valuable as cash. People who feared you were less likely to challenge you. People who respected you were more likely to work with you. And people who admired you might willingly overlook your crimes. The Krays cultivated all three. Their rise accelerated when they established a gang that became known as the Firm. Unlike many criminal groups of the era, the Firm wasn't simply a collection of thugs. Ronnie and Reggie envisioned something larger. They wanted influence. They wanted power. Most of all, they wanted control. Nightclubs became an important part of their empire. The twins acquired businesses that served both legitimate and criminal purposes. These venues generated income while also providing ideal locations for meetings, networking, and influence building. Soon, politicians, celebrities, and criminals could be found under the same roof. The Krays understood something many gangsters never learned. Image mattered. They dressed well. They cultivated connections. They projected confidence. Newspapers began paying attention. Photographs of the twins appeared in magazines. Stories circulated about their glamorous lifestyle. To some, they looked more like celebrities than criminals. But appearances hid a darker reality. Behind the polished suits and nightclub lights was a growing culture of intimidation. Business owners who refused cooperation often faced threats. Rivals who challenged the firm could find themselves beaten. Enemies sometimes disappeared altogether. Violence became a tool of business. Charlie found himself increasingly associated with the family's growing influence. Whether he wanted the attention or not, the Kray name carried weight. People recognized him as the twins' older brother. Doors opened because of that connection. So did dangers. As the empire expanded, Charlie occupied an uncomfortable position. He wasn't the architect of the organization. He wasn't the feared enforcer. He wasn't the public face of the firm. Yet, he remained part of the family at the center of it all. The deeper Ronnie and Reggie ventured into organized crime, the harder it became for Charlie to separate himself from their choices. Meanwhile, Ronnie was becoming increasingly unpredictable. His violent temper was growing more dangerous. His behavior alarmed even some members of the firm. Reggie, in contrast, often appeared calmer and more controlled. Many observers viewed him as the businessman behind the operation. But beneath that calm exterior was a man equally committed to protecting the empire at any cost. Together, the twins formed a powerful and frightening partnership. One supplied intimidation, the other supplied strategy, and both possessed an unwavering belief that loyalty mattered above everything else. That belief would soon be tested, because as the Kray empire expanded across London, it attracted not only wealth and influence, but also enemies. Police investigators were beginning to pay closer attention. Rival gangs were growing restless. And hidden behind the glamour of the Kray legend, a trail of violence was starting to grow. For Charlie Kray, the years ahead would bring a painful realization. Being related to Britain's most feared gangsters came with a price. And sooner or later, everyone in the Kray family would be forced to pay it. By the late 1950s, the Kray name was no longer just known in East London. It was becoming a symbol of power, a symbol of fear, and increasingly, a symbol of violence that could not be ignored. Inside the firm, loyalty was everything. Outside it, loyalty was often enforced. Ronnie Kray, in particular, had developed a reputation that unsettled even hardened criminals. His temper was unpredictable, his violence sudden, and his worldview increasingly distorted by paranoia and control. Those close to him understood a simple rule. You did not cross Ronnie Kray and expect to walk away untouched. Reggie Kray, meanwhile, operated differently. He was more measured, more diplomatic, and more strategic. He could charm businessmen, negotiate with rivals, and maintain a polished public image that masked the brutality beneath. Together, they were a force London had rarely seen. And still, Charlie Kray remained in their orbit. Charlie was not part of the firm's leadership. He was not designing criminal operations or enforcing territory. But he was a Kray, older, visible, and permanently linked to the twins' growing reputation. That connection alone carried weight. In the East End, names mattered almost as much as actions. Being a Kray opened doors, but it also closed others. People assumed power, influence, or danger even when none was directly present. Charlie began to experience this contradiction firsthand. He could walk into certain places and be treated with respect he had not personally earned. Conversations would change when people recognized his surname. Opportunities appeared, sometimes unexpectedly, but so did suspicion. Some assumed he was deeply involved in the firm's activities. Others believed he was an advisor, or even a silent partner in the twins' rise. In reality, Charlie's role was far less defined and far more complicated. He was family first. Everything else came after. That loyalty, however, came at a cost. As Ronnie and Reggie's operations expanded, so did the pressure around them. Protection rackets, nightclub control, and intimidation tactics created both wealth and enemies. The firm's influence spread, but so did the attention of law enforcement. Police investigations were becoming more persistent. Informants began to surface. Rival gangs were no longer intimidated into silence. The fragile balance that had allowed the Krays to operate was beginning to shift. Inside the family, tensions also began to emerge. Ronnie's behavior grew more volatile. His need for dominance extended beyond business into personal relationships. His paranoia increased, and with it, his willingness to use violence without hesitation. Reggie attempted to manage the situation, often stepping in to smooth over disputes or control fallout from Ronnie's actions. But even Reggie could not fully contain him. Charlie observed these changes with growing concern. He was older and perhaps more aware of consequences. Where the twins saw expansion, Charlie saw instability. Where they saw control, he saw escalation. But speaking against them was not simple. In the Kray family, disagreement could feel like betrayal, and betrayal was something the twins did not tolerate easily. At home, Violet Kray remained the emotional center of the family. Her loyalty to her sons was absolute. She protected them fiercely, often refusing to acknowledge the darker rumors surrounding their activities. In her eyes, they were her boys, no matter what the world said. That maternal loyalty reinforced the bond between the brothers. It also made distance almost impossible. Charlie was trapped in a position few could understand. He was not a gangster in the traditional sense, yet he could not fully separate himself from gangster life. He was not driving the empire forward, yet he was constantly pulled into its shadow. Every connection to Ronnie and Reggie carried both privilege and danger, and as the firm's reputation grew, so did the consequences of being associated with it. By the early 1960s, the Kray twins were no longer just local figures. They were becoming legends in London's underworld. And legends, as history often shows, attract attention, not only from admirers, but from those who intend to bring them down. For Charlie Kray, the realization was beginning to set in. The closer you stand to power, the less control you have over where it leads. And in the world of Krays, power was always moving towards something darker, something inevitable. By the early 1960s, London had changed, but the East End still carried its old scars. Rebuilding after the war had not erased poverty. It had only reshaped it. Beneath the new storefronts and expanding nightlife, older systems of control were quietly taking root again. And at the center of one of those systems stood the Kray twins. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were no longer just local gangsters. They had become figures of influence, part feared, part admired, and entirely unavoidable in certain circles. Their nightclub empire expanded. Their connections widened. Their reputation hardened into something almost mythic. And still, Charlie Kray remained in the background, but the shadow he lived under was growing longer. As the twins' influence spread, Charlie's life became increasingly shaped by their world, even when he was not directly involved in it. His surname carried weight that could not be ignored. In some cases, it brought access. In others, it brought scrutiny. People no longer saw Charlie as just a man. They saw him as part of a system built on loyalty, intimidation, and reputation. Inside that system, the firm operated with increasing confidence. Nightclubs became headquarters in disguise. Meetings took place behind velvet ropes and champagne glasses. Deals were struck in places designed to look glamorous while concealing the darker machinery underneath. Ronnie Kray's presence within this world became more intense. His temper was no longer just a rumor. It was a defining trait. Even within his own circle, people began to speak cautiously around him. His unpredictability made him both effective and dangerous. No one could fully anticipate what would trigger his anger or how far it would go. Reggie, on the other hand, worked to maintain order. He managed relationships, negotiated disputes, and attempted to preserve the outward image of respectability the twins had carefully built. To the public, he could appear composed and controlled. But behind that control was pressure, and pressure, in their world, always demanded release. Charlie watched this dynamic unfold with growing unease. He was not blind to what was happening. He saw the consequences of expansion, the tension between ambition and control, and the increasing attention from law enforcement. He understood that the more powerful a firm became, the more fragile it also became. But understanding something is not the same as being able to stop it. The Kray family bond was not just emotional, it was structural. To question it was to risk being excluded from it. And exclusion, in their world, often meant danger. As the twins became more entrenched in London's criminal ecosystem, stories about them multiplied. Some were exaggerated, others were disturbingly accurate. But together, they created an image that was larger than either man alone. The Krays were no longer just criminals. They were becoming symbols of an era, a violent, glamorous, unstable era where power could be built as much through fear as through money. Charlie's position within this evolving narrative remained ambiguous. He was close enough to be associated with their influence, but distant enough that his actual role was often misunderstood. That ambiguity protected him in some ways, but also trapped him in others. He could not fully escape the Kray identity, and yet he was not fully part of its machinery. Meanwhile, police pressure began to increase. Investigations into the firm became more focused. Surveillance intensified. Witnesses began to speak more openly. The walls around the Kray empire were not collapsing yet, but they were no longer invisible, and cracks were beginning to show inside the family as well. Ronnie's instability deepened. His actions became harder to predict. Even Reggie struggled at times to manage the consequences of his brother's behavior. The balance between them, once their greatest strength, was slowly becoming a source of strain. Charlie sensed it before many others did. He saw that the world around them was tightening. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a rope pulled inch by inch. The illusion of control was beginning to fade, and once that illusion breaks, everything underneath it becomes exposed. For Charlie Kray, the danger was not just what his brothers were doing. It was what their world was becoming. A world where loyalty could not guarantee safety, and where being a Kray meant you were never truly outside the storm, only closer to its center. By the mid-1960s, the Kray empire was no longer just expanding. It was entrenching itself into London's nightlife and underworld in a way that felt almost permanent. The firm controlled clubs, influenced business owners, and maintained a reputation that discouraged open opposition. On the surface, it looked like success. Inside, it was something far more unstable. Control built on fear rarely stays control for long. Ronnie Kray had become increasingly volatile. His behavior was no longer just unpredictable. It was disruptive. Even within trusted circles, his presence created tension. Some avoided him entirely when possible. Others spoke cautiously, measuring every word. Reggie Kray continued to act as the stabilizer, the negotiator, the one who tried to keep the machine functioning. But even he could not fully contain the direction things were heading. And Charlie Kray remained caught in between. He was not part of the firm's operational core, yet he could not step away from a family that defined his identity. The Kray name was no longer just a surname. It was a reputation that followed him everywhere. Doors opened because of it, but so did suspicion. People assumed involvement where there was none. They assumed knowledge where there was only proximity. Charlie became, in many ways, a reflection of the twins' world without being its architect. This is where his struggle deepened, because proximity to power is not the same as power itself, and it often comes with less protection than either full inclusion or complete distance. As the firm grew stronger, it also grew more visible. Law enforcement pressure increased steadily. Surveillance became more systematic. Informants began to appear more frequently. The illusion that the Krays operated untouched was beginning to break down. But inside the family, another pressure was building. Loyalty. In the Kray household, loyalty was not simply expected. It was absolute. Violet Kray had raised her sons with an intense belief in family unity. That bond had helped them survive hardship, poverty, and violence in their early years. But as adulthood reshaped them, that same loyalty became more complicated, because loyalty to family began to conflict with survival in the outside world. Charlie understood this tension perhaps more clearly than anyone else. He was old enough to remember when the Kray brothers were just boys trying to find direction. Now, they were men whose decisions carried consequences far beyond their childhood streets. And those consequences were beginning to spread. Ronnie's actions increasingly created friction. His temper led to incidents that could not easily be controlled or explained away. Reggie often had to intervene, clean up, or negotiate the fallout. The strain between maintaining order and preserving reputation became heavier. Charlie saw the cracks forming, but pointing them out was dangerous. In a family like the Krays, truth could be interpreted as betrayal, and betrayal had consequences. So Charlie remained cautious, observing, calculating, and trying to navigate a situation that offered no clean exit. Outside the family, London's criminal landscape was shifting as well. Rival groups were no longer willing to stay intimidated indefinitely. Smaller gangs began to test boundaries. Law enforcement coordination improved. The environment that once allowed the firm to grow unchecked was tightening. The empire was still standing, but it was no longer expanding freely. It was defending its position. That shift changed everything, because expansion is ambition, but defense is pressure, and pressure always demands a response. Within this environment, Charlie's position became even more precarious. He was neither protected by full criminal authority nor shielded by complete distance. He existed in a narrow space defined entirely by association. The Kray name continued to grant him recognition. But recognition is not safety. It is visibility. And in their world, visibility often attracts attention from the wrong kind of people. As 1966 approached, the twins' empire was at its peak, but also at its most fragile. The structures they had built were large, influential, and deeply embedded, but they were also increasingly strained. Charlie could feel it, not through direct involvement, but through atmosphere, the subtle shift in conversations, the growing caution in movements, the increasing seriousness behind decisions that once felt routine. Something was changing, and once it fully changed, there would be no returning to the way things had been, only consequences. By the late 1960s, the Kray Empire no longer felt like an unstoppable force. It still existed. It still commanded fear. It still carried influence across parts of London's criminal and social landscape. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Pressure was no longer distant. It was constant. Police investigations had become more coordinated and persistent. Surveillance was no longer occasional but structured. Witnesses were no longer silent by default. The world around the firm was tightening, and everyone inside it could feel the walls closing in. Ronnie Kray, already unstable in earlier years, became even more volatile under pressure. His temper flared more frequently, his decisions became harder to predict, and his sense of paranoia deepened. Where once there had been intimidation, there was now unpredictability. Reggie Kray tried to maintain control, but control was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. And Charlie Kray remained in the same uneasy position he had occupied for years. Close enough to be affected, but not central enough to influence outcomes. By this stage, Charlie's life was defined less by action and more by consequence. Everything around him was shaped by the choices of others. The Kray name still carried weight. It still opened certain doors. But those doors now came with increased scrutiny on the other side. Association with the twins was no longer just a matter of respect or fear. It was becoming a matter of risk. Inside the family, loyalty remained the core principle. But loyalty was beginning to fracture under pressure. Ronnie's increasingly erratic behavior created tension not just in business dealings, but within the family structure itself. His actions often forced Reggie into reactive roles, managing damage, calming disputes, or negotiating outcomes that should never have been necessary in the first place. The balance between the twins was shifting, and when that balance shifts, everything built upon it becomes unstable. Charlie could see this more clearly than most. He was not blinded by ambition or consumed by control. He had the distance of observation, but not the protection of separation. That made his perspective both clearer and more dangerous, because seeing a collapse does not prevent you from being inside it when it happens. At the same time, external pressure reached a new level. Law enforcement efforts were no longer fragmented. They were becoming coordinated, strategic, and focused. Evidence collection improved. Witness cooperation increased. The illusion of invincibility that had surrounded the Krays for years was beginning to erode. The firm was no longer just being watched. It was being built toward a case. And within that environment, fear spreads differently. It does not explode, it accumulates. People become cautious. Conversations shorten. Trust weakens. Even allies begin to distance themselves quietly. The Kray world was entering that stage. Charlie felt it in subtle ways. A change in tone when his surname was mentioned. A pause before responses. A shift in how people positioned themselves around him. He was not the center of the storm, but he was undeniably within its radius. The psychological burden of that position is often overlooked. To be connected to power without controlling it is to live with constant uncertainty. And uncertainty over time becomes pressure. Within the Kray family itself, Violet Kray continued to hold her sons together emotionally. Her loyalty remained unwavering. But even maternal strength could not fully counteract the external forces building against them. The family bond was strong, but it was no longer enough to shield them from consequence. As 1967 approached, the situation reached a tipping point. The firm's influence was still real, but its foundation was no longer stable. The systems that had once enabled expansion were now producing exposure. The same visibility that had brought notoriety now brought danger. Charlie, watching from within the orbit, began to understand something fundamental. Empires built in the shadows do not fall suddenly. They weaken first, then they tighten, then they break. And once they begin that final stage, even those closest to them cannot step away untouched. The Kray world was approaching that stage now. And for Charlie Kray, the realization was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, because whatever came next would not only define the twins' legacy, it would define everyone tied to them, including the brother history had already started to forget. By 1968, the atmosphere around the Kray Empire had changed completely. What once felt untouchable now felt exposed. The firm still existed, still operated, still carried the weight of its reputation across parts of London, but the illusion of permanence was gone. Beneath the surface, everything was under strain. Police investigations had become more focused, more coordinated, and more determined. What had once been scattered suspicion was now turning into structured case building. Surveillance was constant. Informants were becoming more active, and the net, though not yet visible, was steadily tightening. Ronnie Kray reacted to pressure in the only way he knew how, through escalation. His behavior became more erratic, more confrontational, and more difficult for even close associates to predict. The instability that had once been tolerated as part of his personality was now becoming a liability that could no longer be ignored. Reggie Kray attempted to hold things together. He negotiated, he managed, he intervened where possible. But even his efforts began to feel like damage control, rather than leadership. The structure they built was no longer expanding or stabilizing. It was reacting, and reaction is never as strong as control. Charlie Kray, watching from within the family's orbit, began to understand the seriousness of what was unfolding. For years, he had existed in a complicated space, neither fully inside the criminal machine nor fully outside it. That ambiguity had offered him a kind of fragile protection. But as pressure increased, ambiguity became less a shield and more of a vulnerability. Because in collapsing systems, there is no neutral ground. You're either inside the structure or pulled down with it. As 1968 progressed, law enforcement efforts intensified further. Coordination improved significantly. Evidence gathering became more systematic. Witness accounts began to align. The narrative of the Kray operation was no longer fragmented. It was becoming cohesive. And once a narrative becomes cohesive, it becomes prosecutable. Inside the family, tensions deepened. Ronnie's volatility created constant instability. Reggie's attempt to control were increasingly strained. Decisions that once felt strategic now felt reactive. And beneath everything, a growing sense of inevitability began to take hold. Not everyone spoke it aloud, but many felt it. The idea that something was coming, something unavoidable. Charlie felt it too. But unlike those directly involved in operations, he experienced it differently, not through decisions or meetings or confrontations, but through atmosphere, through silence in conversations that used to be open, through hesitation in places that used to feel familiar, through the subtle withdrawal of people who no longer wanted proximity to risk. Even without formal involvement, association carried consequences. The Kray name still opened doors in some circles, but those doors were no longer welcoming. They were cautious, observant, measuring, and in criminal ecosystems, attention is never neutral. As pressure increased, cracks inside the organization widened further. Trust weakened. Communication became more guarded. The firm was still functioning, but cohesion was fading. And when cohesion fades, fragmentation begins. Charlie began to recognize a pattern forming that he could not ignore. First comes expansion, then visibility, then pressure, then instability, and finally collapse. The Kray world was moving through those stages faster now. What had once taken years was beginning to compress into months. And with that compression came urgency. For those inside the system, choices became narrower. Actions became riskier. Silence became heavier. And for Charlie Kray, the most dangerous realization of all began to form. He was not just witnessing the fall. He was part of its proximity. Because in a system built entirely on family, there is no clean separation between observer and participant, only degrees of involvement. And those degrees stop matching when the structure begins to break. By the end of 1968, the question was no longer whether the Kray Empire would face consequences. The question was how soon, and how severe, and who would be standing closest when it finally arrived. By 1969, the atmosphere around the Kray Empire had shifted from tension to inevitability. What had once been suspicion had now become structure. What had once been surveillance had become coordination. And what had once been fragmented concerns from law enforcement had evolved into a focused effort to dismantle the firm entirely. The walls were no longer closing in slowly. They were already in place. The only thing left was enforcement. For Ronnie and Reggie Kray, this was the most dangerous stage of their lives. Not because they were weaker, but because their environment had changed faster than their instincts could adapt. The systems they had once navigated with confidence were now being studied, mapped, and used against them. Ronnie, increasingly volatile, struggled to interpret the tightening pressure in any controlled way. His reactions became sharper, more aggressive, and often counterproductive. Where restraint might have reduced exposure, escalation only increased it. Reggie attempted to maintain coherence within the remaining structure of the firm, but cohesion was collapsing. Trust had thinned. Communication had become fragmented. The sense of unity that once defined their operation was dissolving under pressure. And Charlie Kray, still not a central operator, but permanently tied by blood, found himself closer than ever to the consequences of a system he did not build but could not escape. By this stage, Charlie's life was defined by proximity to a collapsing structure, not leadership, not control. Proximity. That distinction mattered less and less as time progressed, because collapsing systems do not separate cleanly between architects and bystanders. They pull inward, indiscriminately, until everything connected is affected by the same force. Outside the Kray circle, law enforcement strategy had become highly organized. Evidence was being compiled in a way that connected individuals, locations, and events into a single framework. What once looked like isolated incidents now formed a pattern, and patterns are what prosecutors build cases from. The firm, once perceived as untouchable, was now being treated as a structure that could be legally dismantled. That shift changed everything. Inside the family, pressure manifested in different ways. Ronnie's instability made him increasingly unpredictable in both public and private interactions. Reggie's attempts to maintain control became more defensive than strategic, and the space between them, once filled with shared purpose, became strained with uncertainty. Charlie observed this deterioration not as a participant, but as someone trapped in its gravitational field. He could see the direction things were moving, even when those directly involved resisted acknowledging it. That awareness, however, offered no real escape. It only clarified the stakes. And the stakes were becoming higher with every passing month. Association with the Krays was no longer just a matter of reputation or influence. It had become a matter of legal attention, investigative interest, and potential implication. Even indirect connections carried weight now, and Charlie's connection was anything but indirect. As 1969 progressed, the sense of tightening accelerated. Movements were watched more closely. Interactions carried more caution. Conversations shortened. Silence expanded. The world around the Kray Empire was no longer reactive. It was preparing to act. And that preparation created a psychological shift within everyone connected to it, a sense that something irreversible was approaching. For Charlie, that realization settled into something heavier than fear. It became clarity. He was not at the center of the criminal operation, but he was inside its orbit. And when a system collapses or is taken down, orbit offers no protection, only delayed impact. By the end of 1969, the question was no longer whether the Kray Empire could survive. That question had already been answered by momentum. The only remaining uncertainty was timing and consequences. For the Kray twins, and for the brother who had lived too long in their shadow, the storm was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. It was simply waiting for the moment to break. Early 1960s London had once feared the Kray twins. By 1969 to 1970, London was preparing to end them. The change did not come as a sudden explosion. It came as a carefully constructed operation. Years of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and witness coordination had finally reached a point where law enforcement no longer needed to speculate. They were ready to act. The firm, once seen as untouchable, was now surrounded from every angle. Informants inside, surveillance outside, and a legal framework prepared to turn fragmented incidents into a single, prosecutable narrative. For Ronnie Kray and Reggie Kray, the illusion of control was already gone, though they did not fully accept it yet. Ronnie remained volatile, reacting to pressure with suspicion and aggression. Reggie attempted to maintain structure, but the structure itself had already weakened beyond repair. What remained was no longer an empire. It was a network under observation. And within that collapsing environment, Charlie Kray stood at the edge of consequence, not as a target of the investigation's core, but as a name that could not be separated from it. Because in the eyes of the system being built against the Krays, association was no longer abstract. It was evidence. When the operation finally moved, it moved with precision. Arrests were not chaotic street confrontations. They were coordinated actions designed to prevent escape, resistance, or destruction of evidence. Officers moved on multiple points connected to the Kray network at once, ensuring that communication and coordination were disrupted instantly. The twins' world, once defined by control, was suddenly defined by containment. Ronnie and Reggie were taken into custody separately, and in that separation, something important collapsed. The psychological structure that had supported their dominance for years. Together, they had been powerful. Separated, they were exposed. The arrest marked more than just the fall of two individuals. It marked the end of an era in London's criminal history. News of the arrest spread quickly. For the public, it was a moment of closure, confirmation that the legends, rumors, and fears surrounding the Krays had finally reached a legal conclusion. But for those inside the orb of the family, it was something more complicated. It was uncertainty. Because arrests do not only punish individuals, they unravel networks. And when networks unravel, attention expands outward. Charlie Kray now found himself in a world where the central force that had defined his identity, his family's criminal empire, no longer existed in its previous form. There was no firm to move through, no structure to rely on, no balance between influence and intimidation, only aftermath. In the legal system's view, the focus had been on the twins, but in the wider environment created by the investigation, anyone connected to them was now part of the same historical and procedural context. Charlie understood something many others did not immediately grasp. The arrest was not the end of pressure. It was a beginning of redistribution. Attention would now spread outward, from the core to the edges, from leaders to associates, from architects to connections. And that meant no one tied to Krays could assume they were unaffected. Inside the Kray family itself, the emotional weight of the arrest hit differently depending on perspective. For Violet Kray, it was denial mixed with defiance. For others, it was shock, disbelief, or silence. The world they had known had not simply changed. It had been dismantled. Charlie's position in this moment was especially complex. He was not a central criminal figure in the firm's operations, but he was not separate from it either. He existed in the difficult space between involvement and proximity, exactly the kind of space that becomes dangerous when institutions begin working backward through connections. And now, institutions were doing exactly that. As interrogations began and investigations expanded, the narrative of the Kray Empire started to shift from mythology to documentation. The glamorous surface was stripped away. What remained was structure, evidence, and consequence. For Charlie, the realization was clear. The fall of the Kray twins was not just the end of their power. It was a beginning of scrutiny for everyone attached to them. And in that expanding scrutiny, survival depended on distance. But distance in the Kray world had never truly been an option. Not for family. Not for those who had lived too long inside the shadow. When the dust settled after the arrest of Ronnie and Reggie Kray, London began to tell itself a simple story. 2 gangsters had fallen. An era had ended. Order had been restored. But history is rarely that clean. The collapse of the Kray Empire did not erase its footprint. It scattered it. Across courtrooms, police files, witness statements, and public memory, the name Kray continued to echo long after the twins were removed from the streets. And in that echo, another figure remained quietly attached. Charlie Kray. Unlike Ronnie and Reggie, Charlie was never the face of fear. He was never the headline, never the myth carved into London's criminal folklore in the same way as younger brothers became. But he was there, present in proximity, present in consequence, present in the long shadow cast by the family name. After the arrests, the world changed for Charlie in a way that was less dramatic, but more permanent. There was no single moment of downfall for him, no dramatic courtroom narrative centered on his identity. Instead, there was something more common and in many ways more difficult, the slow redefinition of life after a powerful structure disappears. The Kray name no longer opened the same doors it once had. Where it once created respect or fear, it now created caution. People measured distance. Conversations became careful. Associations were examined more critically. Even without being a central criminal figure, Charlie carried something unavoidable: visibility through connection. And connection, once exposed, never fully disappears. For Ronnie and Reggie Kray, the legal system would define their legacy in detail. Charges, trials, sentences, and prison years that would cement their place in British criminal history. But Charlie's legacy was not defined in the same way. His story lived in the margins, in the space between documented history and lived experience, in the uncomfortable truth that not everyone inside a criminal orbit is an architect of it, but proximity alone can still reshape a life permanently. As time passed, the legend of the Krays only grew stronger in public imagination. Films, books, documentaries, and retellings transformed Ronnie and Reggie into larger-than-life figures, symbols of violent but romanticized underworld. Charlie, however, remained a quieter footnote, yet his existence adds something important to the narrative that is often overlooked. He represents the third dimension of such stories. The family member who is not the myth, not the monster, but still part of the structure that surrounds both. The Kray story is often told as a story of power. But from Charlie's perspective, it is also a story of proximity. Proximity to ambition. Proximity to violence. Proximity to consequences that expand beyond intention. Not every person in a criminal world chooses the center of it. Some are born close to it. Others are pulled into its orbit by loyalty, family, or circumstance. Charlie's life sits in that space, not as justification, not as excuse, but as context. And context matters in understanding how empires like the Krays do not exist in isolation. They exist as networks of relationships, pressures, and identities that extend beyond the individuals who become famous for them. In the end, the title The Third Kray is not about power. It is about position. A position that carries no glory of leadership, no clarity of control, and no protection from consequence. Only the weight of association, and the long shadow that comes with it. As London moved on from the era of the Krays, their names became history. But for Charlie Kray, history was not something he read about. It was something he had lived inside. And long after the empire fell, that shadow never fully left. It simply changed shape. Every empire has a shadow, but some shadows never escape the bloodline. If you want more untold true crime stories like this, subscribe to the Crit Stories and turn on notifications.